A subtle sense of tension can appear in your body before you have any clear thought that explains it. Nothing specific has happened, and there is no obvious problem in front of you. Yet something feels slightly off in a way that is difficult to define. The environment may remain unchanged, but internally there is a shift that makes the moment feel less stable than it was before. This kind of anxiety does not follow a clear storyline, which is why it often feels confusing. You may begin to search for a reason, assuming that something must have triggered the feeling, even if you cannot immediately identify what that might be. The mind moves through recent events, trying to connect the sensation to something concrete that can be understood. However, this process rarely leads to a satisfying answer, and the absence of clarity can make the feeling more noticeable. Without a clear cause, the mind continues to engage with the sensation, attempting to resolve something that does not present itself as a clear problem. In this state, the anxiety is not coming from what is happening externally, but from how your internal system is currently operating. The body can hold a level of activation that exists independently of immediate circumstances. Because of this, the feeling can persist even when nothing in your surroundings requires that level of alertness. This is what makes the experience feel disconnected, as if something is wrong without any visible reason to support it. The reason this kind of anxiety feels unclear is because it does not begin with a specific thought, but with a change in your physiological state. Before the mind starts searching for explanations, the body can already be in a state of heightened activation. This activation is controlled by your nervous system, which continuously monitors your environment and internal condition, often without your awareness. Its role is not to wait for a clear threat, but to detect subtle signals and adjust your level of alertness accordingly. When this system becomes more sensitive, it can shift into a state of readiness, even when there is no immediate danger. In that state, your body prepares as if something requires attention, increasing tension, awareness, and responsiveness. The mind then tries to interpret this state, attempting to match the feeling with a reason that explains it. However, because the activation did not originate from a clear external event, the mind cannot easily find a cause. This is where the experience becomes confusing, as the feeling is real, but the explanation is unclear. The anxiety is not created by your thoughts, but your thoughts are trying to make sense of a state that has already been established. This is why the feeling appears first, and the reasoning comes after, often without arriving at a satisfying conclusion. Sensitivity in the nervous system does not develop randomly, and it is often shaped through repeated exposure to conditions that require constant adjustment. When your system is frequently placed in situations that demand attention, response, or adaptation, it begins to recalibrate what it considers normal. This recalibration does not happen consciously, but through accumulated patterns where activation becomes more common than recovery. As a result, the baseline state of your system can gradually shift toward a higher level of alertness. In this state, the threshold for what is perceived as significant becomes lower, meaning smaller signals can trigger a response. The body begins to react more quickly, even when the situation does not require that level of readiness. Because this pattern builds over time, it does not feel like a sudden change, but rather a gradual shift that is difficult to notice while it is happening. What once required a clear trigger may no longer be necessary, as the system has learned to remain partially activated by default. This is how anxiety can begin to appear without a direct cause, as the system is no longer waiting for a specific event to initiate its response. The feeling is real, but it is not tied to a single moment, making it harder to understand through immediate reasoning. When this heightened state continues without sufficient recovery, it begins to stabilize as a new baseline rather than a temporary reaction. The nervous system does not distinguish between what is frequent and what is necessary, and it adapts to whatever pattern is repeated most consistently. If activation occurs more often than relaxation, the system gradually treats activation as its normal state. This does not feel like a constant surge of anxiety, but more like a subtle, ongoing tension that rarely fully disappears. Because this shift happens gradually, it is difficult to recognize that the baseline itself has changed. You may assume that the way you feel is simply how things are, rather than the result of a system that has adapted to prolonged stimulation. In this condition, moments of calm do not immediately register as natural or stable. Instead, they can feel temporary or even slightly unfamiliar, as if something is missing when there is no tension present. This creates a situation where the system does not fully settle, even when the environment allows it. The absence of stress does not automatically produce relaxation, because the system has not been practicing that state as frequently. This is how anxiety can persist quietly in the background, maintained not by a specific cause, but by a baseline that remains elevated. Once this elevated state becomes consistent, the mind begins to respond to it by trying to explain what it is feeling. The sequence does not begin with a thought, but with a sensation that the system interprets as something requiring attention. Because the body is already activated, the mind assumes there must be a reason, even if one is not immediately visible. This is where the search begins. Attention turns inward, scanning for possible causes that can justify the presence of the tension. The mind moves through recent events, future possibilities, or unresolved situations, attempting to match the feeling with something concrete. However, this process is not driven by clarity, but by the need to reduce uncertainty. As a result, the explanations that emerge are not always accurate, but they feel convincing because they align with the current state of the body. The feeling shapes the thought, not the other way around. This is why the reasons you find can change even while the anxiety remains the same. The system is not responding to reality directly, but to its own internal condition. In this structure, anxiety produces thought, and thought reinforces the sense that something must be wrong. Once thought begins to form around this internal tension, it does not remain neutral in how it interprets the situation. The mind is not simply observing the feeling, but actively trying to resolve it by assigning meaning to what is being experienced. Because the body is already in a heightened state, the interpretations tend to lean toward caution, uncertainty, or potential problems. This is not a deliberate choice, but a natural extension of how the system is currently operating. When the nervous system is activated, the brain becomes more sensitive to anything that could represent risk, even if that risk is minimal or hypothetical. As a result, the thoughts that arise are more likely to focus on what might go wrong, what could be missing, or what has not been fully resolved. These interpretations begin to shape how the feeling is understood. Instead of recognizing the anxiety as a state, the mind starts to treat it as evidence. The presence of tension is taken as a signal that something must be wrong, which justifies the continued search for a problem. This is where the loop strengthens. The feeling generates thought, the thought confirms the feeling, and both begin to reinforce each other without requiring an external trigger. As this cycle continues, the system becomes more convinced that the anxiety is meaningful, even when it is not connected to a specific situation. The mind does not realize that it is responding to its own interpretation, rather than to something that actually needs to be addressed. This is how anxiety becomes self-sustaining, through a process where perception and interpretation continuously support each other. Breaking this loop is difficult because the system interprets control as a form of safety. When anxiety appears, the immediate instinct is to reduce it by analyzing, correcting, or resolving whatever seems to be causing it. This response feels reasonable because it gives the impression that you are addressing the problem directly. However, in this structure, the act of trying to control the feeling becomes part of the process that keeps it active. Each attempt to eliminate the anxiety reinforces the idea that the feeling is significant and requires attention. The system learns that anxiety leads to increased focus, which makes it more likely to remain present. This is why the experience can intensify when you try to stop it. The more effort you apply to removing the feeling, the more the system interprets that effort as confirmation that something is wrong. As a result, the cycle continues, not because the anxiety is growing on its own, but because the response to it is maintaining its importance. This creates a situation where the strategy that should reduce the problem becomes the mechanism that sustains it. The difficulty is not a lack of control, but a pattern where control is applied in a way that reinforces the original state. Understanding this changes the focus from trying to eliminate anxiety to examining how your response is shaping its persistence. Allowing the feeling to remain without reacting to it often sounds simple in theory. But in practice, it can feel unexpectedly difficult. The discomfort does not come only from the anxiety itself, but from the absence of action that you are used to taking when it appears. When the system has been conditioned to respond quickly, not responding can feel like neglecting something important. There is a sense that something should be done, even if you cannot clearly define what that is. This creates a secondary layer of tension, where the discomfort is not just the original feeling, but the lack of response to it. The mind begins to question whether ignoring the feeling will make it worse, or whether something necessary is being overlooked. Because of this, remaining still in the presence of anxiety can feel unstable, as if you are stepping away from control rather than maintaining it. However, what is actually happening is a shift in how control is defined. Instead of controlling the feeling directly, you are changing how the system reacts to it. This requires tolerating a short period where the usual response is not applied. During that time, the system does not immediately understand what is happening, which is why the discomfort can feel more noticeable at first. But this phase is part of the transition, where the pattern begins to lose its automatic structure. When the usual reaction is no longer applied, the system is placed in a condition it has not been trained to handle. Instead of receiving immediate reinforcement through analysis, checking, or interpretation, the initial wave of anxiety is allowed to remain without being extended. This creates a different trajectory. The feeling does not disappear instantly, but it also does not evolve into a prolonged state in the same way it previously did. Without continuous engagement, the nervous system does not receive confirmation that the activation needs to be sustained. This begins to change how long the response lasts. The duration of the feeling becomes shorter, not because it is suppressed, but because it is not being actively maintained. At first, this reduction may be difficult to notice, as the difference can be subtle. However, the direction of the change is consistent. Each time the pattern is interrupted, even briefly, the system receives a different signal about how to respond to similar internal states. Instead of learning that tension requires analysis, it begins to register that tension can exist without immediate action. This distinction gradually reshapes the baseline. The threshold for activation begins to adjust as the previous loop is no longer being reinforced with the same intensity. What once led to extended anxiety now results in a shorter, more contained experience. This is how the system begins to recalibrate itself, not through force but through repeated exposure to a different response pattern. One of the reasons this change feels slow is because the system you are working with is not designed for immediate adjustment. The nervous system operates based on accumulated patterns, not single decisions, which means it does not shift its baseline after one or two different responses. Even when you apply a new way of responding, the previous pattern still holds more weight, simply because it has been repeated more often. This can create the impression that nothing is changing, especially in the early stages. You may still feel the same level of tension, or notice that the same reactions continue to appear, which can make the effort feel ineffective. However, what is actually happening is less visible. The system is beginning to register a new pattern, but it has not yet been reinforced enough to replace the old one. This is similar to how habits form, where repetition gradually shifts what feels automatic. In the same way, the absence of immediate results does not mean the process is not working. It means the system is still prioritizing what it knows more strongly. As the new response is repeated, the balance begins to change. The previous pattern loses some of its influence, while the new pattern becomes more accessible. This shift is gradual, but it is cumulative. Each moment where the cycle is not reinforced contributes to a larger adjustment in how the system operates. At this stage, one of the most common difficulties is not the method itself, but how the lack of immediate change is interpreted. When the feeling does not decrease right away, it is easy to assume that the approach is not working. This interpretation can lead to a return to old patterns because they feel more responsive, even if they are less effective in the long term. The mind tends to prioritize what produces a noticeable change, even if that change is temporary. Analyzing, checking, or trying to resolve the feeling can create a short sense of control, which makes it appear more useful than it actually is. In contrast, allowing the feeling without reacting does not produce an immediate sense of relief, which can make it seem passive or ineffective. This difference in feedback is what often leads to inconsistency. The system begins to alternate between approaches, never applying the new pattern long enough for it to become stable. Another factor is the expectation of how change should feel. If the expectation is that anxiety should disappear quickly, the slower nature of recalibration can feel like failure. This creates frustration, which can trigger the very pattern you are trying to change. The difficulty, then, is not only in changing the response, but in maintaining it without relying on immediate confirmation. This requires a shift in how progress is measured. Instead of looking for instant reduction, the focus becomes whether the pattern is being reinforced or interrupted. A more stable approach begins when the goal is simplified into something that can be applied consistently, regardless of the situation. Instead of trying to manage every variation of anxiety, the focus shifts to a single principle that can guide your response each time the pattern appears. That principle is not about removing the feeling, but about not extending it. In practical terms, this means recognizing when the system has become activated and choosing not to reinforce that activation through repeated analysis. This does not require perfect awareness or constant control. It requires a basic recognition of when thinking is no longer helping and a willingness to stop engaging at that point. The simplicity of this approach is what makes it sustainable. You do not need to understand every detail of why the anxiety is present, and you do not need to resolve it immediately. You only need to notice when the process shifts from useful thinking into repetitive processing. Once that shift is identified, the response becomes consistent. You reduce engagement rather than trying to produce a better explanation. This creates a structure that can be applied in different contexts without needing to adjust it each time. Over time, this consistency becomes more important than precision. The system responds more to repeated patterns than to occasional insight. In real situations, the shift often fails, not because the principle is unclear, but because the moment where it needs to be applied passes too quickly. The transition from a neutral state into anxiety does not usually announce itself in an obvious way. It begins as a subtle change in tension, a slight increase in alertness, or a vague sense that something feels off. Because this shift is gradual, it is easy to miss the point where the pattern actually starts. By the time you become fully aware of the feeling, the system may already be engaged in analysis, making it harder to step out. This is where attention needs to be redirected earlier in the process. Instead of waiting until the anxiety becomes clear, you begin to notice the first signs of activation. These signs are often physical rather than cognitive. A slight tightness, a change in breathing, or a feeling of restlessness can appear before any structured thought forms. Recognizing these signals creates an earlier entry point. At that point, the response does not need to be complex. It simply requires not converting that initial activation into extended thinking. Another common point where the loop reappears is during transitions, such as moving from one task to another, or entering moments of inactivity. These gaps often trigger the system to search for something to process, which can lead back into the same cycle. By becoming aware of these specific moments, the pattern becomes easier to interrupt before it fully develops. When the entire structure is viewed together, the experience becomes easier to understand in a more precise way. The feeling does not begin with a clear problem, but with a shift in your internal state. That state creates a sense of tension, which the mind then attempts to interpret. Because the feeling comes first, the explanation is built afterward, often without a stable reference. This leads to a loop where the body maintains activation, and the mind continues to search for reasons that justify it. Each part of this process supports the others. The activation creates the need for explanation, and the explanation reinforces the activation. This is why the experience feels continuous, even though it is made up of smaller steps that repeat. Understanding this changes where your attention needs to go. Instead of focusing on the content of your thoughts, the focus shifts to the process itself. You begin to observe when the system becomes activated, when the mind starts searching, and when the loop begins to sustain itself. This creates a clearer point of intervention. The goal is no longer to solve the thought, but to recognize the pattern. Once the pattern is visible, your response can change in a more consistent way. This reduces the intensity of the loop, not by removing it entirely, but by limiting how far it is allowed to develop. At the center of this entire experience is a simple but often overlooked distinction. The feeling of anxiety is not always a signal that something is wrong, but your response to that feeling determines whether it becomes a sustained state. When every internal shift is treated as something that must be explained or resolved, the system remains active without interruption. This is what transforms a temporary condition into something that feels constant. The most important change is not removing the feeling, but changing how much importance you assign to it when it appears. If the system is allowed to activate without being continuously reinforced, it begins to regulate itself more effectively. This does not mean the feeling disappears immediately, and it does not mean you will never experience it again. It means that the duration, intensity, and frequency of the experience begin to change over time. In practical terms, the key is not to follow every signal that your system produces. Some signals reflect real situations that require attention, while others are simply expressions of a system that has become overly sensitive. Learning to distinguish between the two changes how you respond. When this distinction becomes consistent, the pattern begins to lose its structure. The system no longer treats every internal change as something that must be sustained. This is where stability begins to return, not through control, but through a different relationship with what you feel.